In order to grasp phenomenally what is heard in understanding the summons, we shall take up this summons anew. Summoning the They-Self means calling forth the authentic self to its potentiality of being, as Dasein, that is, as being in the world, taking care of things and being with others. The existential interpretation of that to which the call calls forth thus cannot seek to define any concrete individual possibility of existence if it understands itself correctly in its methodical possibilities and tasks. What can be established, and what seeks to get established, is not what is called in and to each particular Dasein from an existential standpoint, but is rather what belongs to the existential condition of the possibility of each and every factical and existential potentiality of being. When the call is understood with an existential kind of hearing, such understanding is the more authentic the more Dasein hears and understands its own being summoned in a non-relational way, and the less the meaning of the call gets distorted by what one says is considered proper and fitting. In what, then, does the authenticity of understanding the summons essentially reside? What is essentially given to understand in any particular call, even if it is not always factically understood? We have already answered this question in our thesis that the call says nothing which could be talked about. It does not give any information about events. The call directs Dasein forward toward its potentiality of being, as a call out of uncanniness. The caller is indeed indefinite, but where it calls from is not indifferent for the calling. Where it comes from, the uncanniness of thrown individuation is also called in the calling, that is also disclosed. Where the call comes from in calling forth to, is that to which it is called back. The call does not give us to understand an ideal, universal potentiality of being. It discloses it as what is actually individualized in that particular Dasein. The disclosive character of the call has not been completely determined until we understand it as a calling back that calls forth. Only if we are oriented toward the call thus understood may we ask what it gives to understand. But is the question of what the call says not answered more easily and certainly by the simple reference to what we generally hear or fail to hear in any experience of conscience, namely, that the call addresses Dasein as guilty, or, as in the warning conscience, refers to possible guilt, or, as a good conscience, confirms that one is conscious of no guilt? If only this guilty, about which our experiences are in such agreement, were not defined in such completely different ways in the experience and interpretation of conscience. And even if the meaning of this guilty could be conceived in a way all could agree with, the existential concept of this being guilty would still be obscure. However, when Dasein addresses itself as guilty, where should its idea of guilt be drawn from if not from the interpretation of its own being? But the question arises again, who says how we are guilty and what guilt means? The idea of guilt cannot be arbitrarily thought up and forced upon Dasein. But if an understanding of the essence of guilt is possible at all, this possibility must have been sketched out in Dasein beforehand. How are we to find that trace that can lead to revealing this phenomenon? All ontological inquiries into phenomena such as guilt, conscience, and death must start from what everyday Dasein says about them. Because its kind of being is entangled, the way Dasein gets interpreted is for the most part inauthentically oriented, and does not get at the essence, since the primordially appropriate ontological kind of questioning remains alien to it. Whenever we see something wrongly, a directive as to the primordial idea of the phenomenon is also revealed. But where do we get our criterion for the primordial, existential meaning of guilty? From the fact that this guilty turns up as a predicate of the I am. Does what is understood as guilt, in inauthentic interpretation, possibly lie in the being of Dasein as such, in such a way that it is also already guilty in that it actually, factically exists? Thus, by invoking the guilty, which everyone agrees that one hears, one has not yet answered the question of the existential meaning of what is called in the call. This must first be defined if we are to make intelligible what the call of guilty means, and why and how it gets distorted in its significance by the everyday interpretation. Everyday common sense initially takes being guilty in the sense of owing something, having something on account. One is supposed to return something to the other which is due to him. This being guilty, as having debts, Schuldenhaben, is a way of being with others in the field of taking care of things, as in providing something or bringing it along. Further modes of taking care of things are depriving, borrowing, withholding, taking, robbing, that is, in some way not doing justice to the claims that others have made as to their possession. This kind of being guilty is related to things that can be taken care of. Being guilty has the further significance of being responsible for, Schuld sein in, that is, being the cause or author of something or being the occasion for something. In the sense of this being responsible for something, one can be guilty without owing anything to someone else or coming to owe him. Conversely, one can owe something to another without being responsible for it oneself. Another person can incur debts to others for me. These vulgar significations of being guilty as having debts with and being responsible for can go together and determine a kind of behavior which we call making oneself responsible, sich schuldig machen. That is, by having the responsibility for having a debt, one may break a law and make oneself punishable. However, the requirement that one fails to satisfy need not necessarily be related to possessions. It can regulate public being with one another in general. This making oneself responsible by breaking a law, as we have defined it, can, at the same time, have the character of becoming responsible to others, schuldig werden and anderen. That does not occur by breaking a law as such, but through my having the responsibility schuld habe for the others becoming jeopardized in his existence, led astray, or even destroyed. This becoming responsible to others is possible without breaking the public law. The formal concept of being responsible, in the sense of having become responsible to others, can be defined as being the ground for a lack in the Dasein of another, in such a way that this being the ground itself is defined as lacking in terms of that for which it is the ground. This kind of lacking is a failure to satisfy some demand placed on one's existing being with others. It remains a question how such demands arise, and in what way the character of their demands and laws is to be conceived on the basis of this origin. In any case, being guilty in this latter sense of breaking a moral requirement is a kind of being of Dasein. Of course, that is also true of being guilty as making oneself punishable, as having debts, and of any having responsibility for. These, too, are modes of behavior of Dasein. Very little is said by taking burden with moral guilt as a quality of Dasein. On the contrary, it only thus becomes evident that this characterization is not sufficient for distinguishing ontologically between this kind of determination of being, of Dasein, and the other ways of behaving just listed. The concept of moral guilt is thus so little clarified ontologically that interpretations of this phenomenon which include in its concept, or even employ in its definition, the ideas of deserving punishment or of having debts to someone, could become and remain prevalent. But in this way, the guilty is again forced aside into the realm of taking care of things, in the sense of calculating and counterbalancing claim. The clarification of the phenomenon of guilt, which is not necessarily related to having debts and breaking the law, can be successful only if we ask beforehand in principle about the being guilty of Dasein. That is, only if the idea of guilty is conceived in terms of the kind of being of Dasein. For this purpose, the idea of guilty must be formalized to the extent that the vulgar phenomena of guilt, which one related to being with others in taking care of things, drop out. The idea of guilt must not only be removed from the area of calculating and taking care of things, but must also be separated from the relationship to an ought and a loss such that by failing to comply with it, one burdens oneself with guilt. For here, too, guilt is still necessarily defined as a lack, when something which ought to be and can be is missing. But to be missing means not being present. A lack, as the not being present of what ought to be, is a determination of being of objective presence. In this sense, nothing can be essentially lacking in existence, not because it is complete, but because its character of being is distinguished from any kind of objective presence. Still, the character of the not nicht is present in the idea of guilty. If the guilty is to be able to define existence, the ontological problem arises here of clarifying existentially the not character of this not. Furthermore, there belongs to the idea of guilty that which is expressed without differentiation in the concept of guilt as being responsible for, being the ground for. Thus we define the formal existential idea of guilty as being the ground for a being sane which is determined by a not, that is, being the ground of a nullity nichtigkeit. If the idea of the not present in the existentially understood concept of guilt excludes relatedness to anything objectively present which is possible or which ought to be, if thus Dasein is altogether incommensurate with something objectively present or valid which it itself is not, or which is not in the way Dasein is, that is, exists, then any possibility that, with regard to being the ground for a lack, the being that is itself such a ground might be reckoned as deficient, is a possibility that is excluded. If a lack, such as a failure to fulfill some requirement, has been caused in a way characteristic of Dasein, we cannot simply calculate back to a deficiency of the cause. Being thegron for need not have the same character of not as the privativum, which is grounded in it and arises from it. The ground need not acquire its nullity from that which grounds it. But this means that being guilty does not result from an indebtedness, but the other way around. Indebtedness is possible only on the basis of a primordial being guilty. Can something like this be pointed to in the being of Dasein, and how is it existentially possible at all? The being of Dasein is care. It includes in itself facticity, thrownness, existence, project, and falling prey. Dasein exists as thrown, brought into its there not of its own accord. It exists as a potentiality of being which belongs to itself, and yet has not given itself to itself. Existing, it never gets back behind its thrownness so that it could ever release this, that it is and has to be, from its being a self and lead it into the there. But thrownness does not lie behind it as an event which actually occurred, something that happened to it and was again separated from Dasein. Rather, as long as it is, Dasein is constantly its that as care. As this being, delivered over to which it can exist uniquely as the being which it is, existing, the ground of its potentiality of being. Even though it has not laid the ground itself, it rests in the weight of it, which mood reveals to it as a burden. And how is Dasein this thrown ground? Only by projecting itself upon the possibilities into which it is thrown. The self, which as such has to lay the ground of itself, can never gain power over that ground, and yet it has to take over being the ground in existing. Be its own thrown ground, is the potentiality of being about which care is concerned. Being the ground grundseiend, that is, existing as thrown, Dasein constantly lags behind its possibility. It is never existent before its ground, but only from it and as it. Thus being the ground means never to gain power over one's almost being from the ground up. This not nicht belongs to the existential meaning of thrown. Being the ground grundseiend, it itself is a nullity of itself. Nullity by no means signifies not being present or not subsisting, but means a not that constitutes this being of Dasein, its thrownness. The quality of this not as a not is determined existentially. Being seiend as self, Dasein as self, is the thrown being. Not through itself, but released to itself from the ground in order to be as the ground. Dasein is not itself the ground of its being, because the ground first arises from its own project, but as a self, it is the being sane of its ground. The ground is always ground only for a being whose being has to take over being the ground. Dasein is its ground by existing, that is, in such a way that it understands itself in terms of possibilities, and thus understanding itself is thrown being. But this means that, as a potentiality of being, it always stands in one possibility or another. It is constantly not other possibilities, and has relinquished them in its existential project. As thrown, the project is not only determined by the nullity nichticate of being the ground, but is itself as project essentially null nichtic. Again, this definition by no means signifies the ontic property of being unsuccessful, or of no value, but an existential constituent of the structure of being of project. This nullity belongs to the being free of Dasein for its existential possibility. But freedom is only in the choice of the one, that is, in bearing the fact of not having chosen and not being able also to choose the others. In the structure of thrownness, as well as in that of the project, essentially lies a nullity. And it is the ground for the possibility of the nullity of inauthentic Dasein, in its falling prey which it always already in each instance factically is. Care itself is in its essence thoroughly permeated with nullity. Care, the being of Dasein, thus means, as thrown project, being the null ground of a nullity. And that means that Dasein is as such guilty, if our formal existential definition of guilt as being the ground of a nullity is valid. Existential nullity by no means has the character of a privation, of a lack as compared with an ideal which is set up, but is not attained in Dasein. Rather, the being of this being is already null as project before everything that it can project and usually attain. Thus this nullity does not occur occasionally in Dasein, attached to it as a dark quality that it could get rid of if it made sufficient progress. Still, the ontological meaning of the noteness nichtheit of this existential nullity remains obscure. But that is true also of the ontological essence of the not in general. Of course, ontology and logic have expected much of the not, and thus at times made its possibilities visible without revealing it itself ontologically. Ontology found the not and made use of it. But is it then so self-evident that every not means a negativum in the sense of a lack? Does its positivity get depleted insofar as it constitutes a transition, Why does every dialectic take refuge in negation, without grounding negation itself dialectically, without even being able to locate it as a problem? Has anyone ever made the ontological origin of noteness a problem at all, or, before that, even looked for the conditions on the basis of which the problem of the not and its noteness, and the possibility of this noteness, could be raised? And where else should they be found than in a thematic clarification of the meaning of being in general? The concepts of privation and lack, which, moreover, are hardly transparent, are insufficient for the ontological interpretation of the phenomenon of guilt, though if we take them formally enough, we can put them to considerable use. Least of all, can we get nearer to the existential phenomenon of guilt by taking our orientation toward the idea of evil, the malum as privatio boni. The bonum and the privatio have the same ontological provenance in the ontology of objective presence, which also characterizes the idea of value derived from that. Beings whose being is care can not only burden themselves with factical guilt, but they are guilty in the ground of their being. This being guilty first gives the ontological condition for the fact that Dasein can become guilty while factically existing. This essential being guilty is, equiprimordially, the existential condition of the possibility of the morally good and evil, that is, for morality in general and its possible factical forms. Primordial being guilty cannot be defined by morality, because morality already presupposed it for itself. But what experience speaks for this primordial being guilty of Dasein? However, one should not forget the counter-question. Is guilt there only if a consciousness of guilt is awakened, or does not the most primordial being guilty make itself known in the very fact that guilt is sleeping? The fact that this primordial being guilty, initially, and for the most part remains undisclosed, and is kept closed off by the entangled being of Dasein, reveals only this aforesaid nullity. Being guilty is more primordial than any knowing wissen about it. Only because Dasein is guilty in the ground of its being, and closes itself off from itself as thrown and fallen prey, is conscience possible, if indeed the call basically gives us to understand this being guilty. The call is the call of care. Being guilty constitutes the being that we call care. Dasein stands primordially together with itself in uncanniness. Uncanniness brings this being face to face with its undisguised nullity, which belongs to the possibility of its own most potentiality of being. Insofar as Dasein as care is concerned about its being, it calls itself as a they that has factically fallen prey, and calls itself from its uncanniness to its potentiality of being. The summons calls back by calling forth to the possibility of taking over in existence the thrown being that it is, back to thrownness in order to understand it as the null ground that it has to take up into existence. The calling back in which conscience calls forth gives Dasein to understand that Dasein itself as the null ground of its null project, standing in the possibility of its being, must bring itself back to itself from its lostness in the they, and this means that it is guilty. What Dasein thus gives itself to understand would then, after all, be a knowledge kenntnis about itself. And the hearing corresponding to that call would be a taking notice kenntnisnam of the fact of being guilty. But if the call is indeed to have the character of a summons, does not this interpretation of conscience lead to a complete distortion of its function? Summoning to being guilty, is that not summoning to evil? Even the most violent interpretation would not wish to impose upon conscience such a meaning for the call. But then what is summoning to being guilty supposed to mean? The meaning of the call becomes clear if our understanding of it keeps to the existential meaning of being guilty, instead of making basic the derivative concept of guilt in the sense of an indebtedness arising from some deed done or left undone. Such a demand is not arbitrary if the call of conscience, coming from Dasein itself, is directed solely to this being. But then summoning to being guilty means a calling forth to the potentiality of being that I always am as Dasein. Dasein need not first burden itself with guilt through failures or omissions. It must only be authentically the guilty that it is. Then the correct hearing of the summons is tantamount to understanding oneself in one's own most potentiality of being, that is, in projecting oneself upon one's own most authentic potentiality for becoming guilty. When Dasein understandingly lets itself be called forth to this possibility, this includes its becoming free for the call, the readiness for being able to be summoned. Understanding the call, Dasein listens to its own most possibility of existence. It has chosen itself. With this choice, Dasein makes possible its almost being guilty, which remains closed off to the they self. The common sense of the they recognizes only what satisfies, and what fails to satisfy with respect to manageable rules and public standards. It calculates infractions of them and tries to balance them all. The they-self has slunk away from its almost being guilty, and so it talks about mistakes all the more vociferously. But in the summons, the they-self is summoned to the almost being guilty of the self. Understanding the call is choosing, but it is not a choosing of conscience, which as such cannot be chosen. What is chosen is having a conscience, as being free for one's almost being guilty. Understanding the summons means wanting to have a conscience. This does not mean wanting to have a good conscience, nor does it mean willfully cultivating the call. It means solely the readiness to be summoned. Wanting to have a conscience is just as far away from searching out one's factical indebtedness as it is from the tendency to liberation from guilt, in the sense of the essential guilty. Wanting to have a conscience is rather the most primordial existential presupposition for the possibility of factically becoming guilty. Understanding the call, Dasein lets its almost self take action in itself, in terms of its chosen potentiality of being. Only in this way can it be responsible variantward. Factically, every action is necessarily without conscience, not only because it does not avoid factical moral indebtedness, but because, on the basis of the null ground of its null project, it has always already become guilty toward others in being with them. Thus, wanting to have a conscience takes over the essential lack of conscience, within which alone there is the existential possibility of being good. Although the call does not give us any information, it is not merely critical but positive. It discloses the most primordial potentiality of being of Dasein as being guilt. Thus, conscience reveals itself as an attestation belonging to the being of Dasein, an attestation in which conscience calls Dasein forth to its almost potentiality of being. And the authentic potentiality of being, thus, attested to be defined existentially in a more concrete way. But now that we have shown a potentiality of being that is attested to in Dasein itself, a preliminary question arises. Can we claim sufficient evidential weight for the way we have shown this? As long as the strange feeling remains that the interpretation of conscience has been traced back one-sidedly to the constitution of Dasein, while hastily passing over all of the findings that are familiar to the vulgar interpretation of conscience. Is the phenomenon of conscience still recognizable at all, as it really is in our interpretation? Have we not been all too sure of ourselves in the ingenuousness with which we deduced an idea of conscience from the constitution of being of Dasein? The last step in our interpretation of conscience is the existential delimitation of the authentic potentiality of being to which conscience attests. If we are to assure ourselves of a way of access that will make such a step possible, even for the vulgar understanding of conscience, then we need explicit evidence for the connection between the results of the ontological analysis and the everyday experiences of conscience.